Hello everyone, today we talk about Pictish warfare between the 3rd and the 6th century, which is a pretty arbitrary time frame that I follow, however, for my Enemies of Rome playlist that, however, address the single people's warfares autonomously. I already discussed Pictish warfare, namely in a video about Pictish cavalry, from probably the 3rd to the 8th century, so encompassing the entire history. And let's say that today's video is can be treated, at least in part, as covering the entire Pictish historical timeline, because essentially there weren't radical changes in their way of war, nor this would be documentable largely had they existed. But there were quite say stable cultures that also didn't differ dramatically from their neighbors in the kind of warfare. So comparatively and diachronically, we have an idea of what their culture really was. Recently, we talked about Scottish warfare as well. I talked about the Giles already in a comprehensive way, and very often we're paradoxically also more documented about the Scots than the Picts themselves, and in part we're talking about the same people, as you know, as fundamentally we have also seen in the recent video about medieval Scotland. Pictland would become Scotland for a series of political and cultural, also military social mechanisms that we have began to address there, and that will come back on. So I will make anyhow, or at least I plan to, God allowing, to make a video about early medieval Pictish warfare in a more kind of later timeline, let's say, Pictish tactics and various Pictish units and army organization, etc. So what we look at today is just a more comprehensive image of Pictish warfare, the Brochs, the relation with Rome, by the way, and generally speaking, the essentials of this military culture. Not excessively in depth, but we will try to also digress when useful about certain specific aspects of Pictish military culture. And as you know, as an audience coming prevalently from the Anglosphere, the concept of Pictish identity and its connection with the Caledonian one, with the Scottish one, etc., is quite, at least has been for a long time, a matter of historiographical controversy. All right, we could digress really far, looking at a bit of, how the Picts really worked in British historiography and in kind of the sense the meanings that were attached to them, and varying in various centuries depending on, in fact, the tempers of the time. But let's say historiography is very advanced today, and so what it really gets down to prospectively is, the Picts emerged as a political entity that also, there weren't many ethnic shifts, right? They were more or less the same people that had inhabited roughly today's Scotland, referred to as most of the part of the northern part, just like the Caledonians or Caledons or Caledonian, or whatever you want to call them, like. And the Picts were emerging as a likely comeback of this Celtic, or historically, Celticized populations at the decline of the same Rome, and after actually a massive onslaught that had been carried out by Septimius Severus at the beginning of the 3rd century AD, that effectively crushed what we know as the Caledonians, right, and probably helped catalyzing the emergence of a new identity. The etymology of the Picts, however, is somewhat controversial. It probably literally meant painted people in a broader etymological sense, because this is not true just for the Latin term, but also in other languages. It's just we don't know how they really called themselves, or what was at least the true identitary substratum between also, in fact, different tribes, different smaller polities that are witnessed historically by the Romans, by, say, the Welsh, by the Scots, and so on. So I will not descend into that, right? The word, the Cruithne as well, was the name defined as they maybe called themselves. Literally, it's a name that also, in fact, comes as the forefathers of the Picts at some point in their mythology. That means Britons in a sense. So, but there are debates regarding this. In any case, it's not so enormously relevant. These people were living at the outskirts of the known world that you would expect to be a relatively, stable reality, if anything, because of the broader primitiveness in a sense. And instead, the Picts come a bit to break this picture, because they not only emerge as a sort of new people in the far north, but they also are a very heavily militarized one. And regarding the ethnic background, again, in spite of the Celtic and also pre-Indo-European background, naturally, it's pretty much common as a blend in many parts of Europe. You do realize that in late antiquity, the North Sea, the British Isles in general, were subjected to a very dynamic set of interactions, of cooperations, coordinations with other peoples. It could go as far as Scandinavia. There is a problem, as we will see now, posed also by the same Brochs. So these large stone towers that at a point could evolve in kind of larger castle-like systems, as we will see, that are importantly located also on the Orkneys, and the easternmost part of these of this group of fortresses, in fact, is not being even successfully dated. We don't have an idea in the narrower timeline when they were, say, built and or used, right? They are all date to the Iron Age, which is also a relatively vague concept, especially towards the latter end, and that show of an important broad range of interaction. That think about the Kingdom of the Isles later on, the various, in fact, Pictish, Scottish, also the kind of more mysterious Atticoti raids that are not very different, also in coordination with some Germanic elements in Central Northern Europe, to the Viking era, at this disintegration of such a leviathan like the Roman Empire would be the Carolingian one later on. So historiography very often, this is typical of modernism and secularism, has to somewhat stick to to a categorical and over-labeling and kind of sclerotized form of an incomprehensive form of historical identification, whereas there are much more comprehensive dynamics that help, in a sense, constituting what were mostly political and also military, as a consequent, universal traditional meanings. There are other interesting theories that regard also a bit the so-called Arthurian age, some alleged Scythian ancestry, the idea that some Sarmatic or Germanic also, because at the end of the day the Romans did settle important amount of such foederati in Britain, as you know. It would have taken over, even in the same Pict land at some point, important strongholds, and beginning to lord over the locals in a kind of course in a full cooperation with the local aristocracy. Surely there is a bit of truth in all of this. It's just we can't properly quantify this, right? It's unlikely, especially the latter hypothesis, to have been, by scale, particularly relevant. But the remilitarization, even of an area that had been in part practically subdued, right, by the Romans, and that's yet another thing that we have to realize, that the fact that first of all, there were no borders at the time, so there is no such thing, even in the presence of the Antonine or the Hadrian's Wall, like of a truly kind of 19th century statalistic, nationalistic concept of, with from one side of the border from the other. In the far north, there was fundamentally nothing that the Romans had deemed to be that worth of kind of direct occupation. These peoples were, in practice, not interested in Romanization, or at least they were not essentially to absorb most of even the advantages that other populations all over Europe, including the Celtic ones, had immediately gotten, simply because they were more developed at a point. And the walls, too, indicate this problem, mostly of raiding, right? It's not, it was very imposing infrastructures that were thought to be held on the long run, not because of a major threat, right? The Romans didn't create a wall in Germany or in Mesopotamia. There were different systems of fortification, but these more massive ones, paradoxically, were just, you see, between the north and the Irish Sea across Britain, effective enough to block mostly incursions, right? And so stopping this continuous harassment that was going on, because these peoples were, as we will see now, also brutally militaristic in their tribal clinic lifestyle, were extremely violent and extremely proclivious to that kind of lifestyle, also because they, in fact, those were not cultures that could survive otherwise, right? And so it was just their essence, their true identity, and their way of life. But at a certain point, also the Roman Empire collapses, so they found themselves, let's say, with freer hand. And this mostly I discussed, in fact, in the video about the Pictish cavalrymen. That is a very fine piece of equestrian culture, and not only, right, in the broader Pictish military system, that as I think it was pretty advanced, right? First of all, Caledonia always had apparently more developed equestrian culture than any other British area, right? The Britons had cavalry, chariotry. The Picts seemed to have kept using even the latter for an important amount of time. In any case, that was kind of ending, and it's mostly the Caledonians that that used it. But the Romans do document it for the Picts late, even though they seemingly the Picts revived a more effective, in fact, equestrian culture. Right, cavalry was a bit the future, truly, not chariotry at that point. But in this northern European realities, like chariotry had remained, again, because of the aforementioned reasons, and not, in fact, to a great fortune. I made a video about the Battle of Mons Graupius as well, which shows pretty brutally how the Romans, and actually even just their Germanic auxiliaries there, dispensed of the Caledonian host that was practically massacred as a prelude to the early 3rd century more comprehensive extermination, right? Some talk about ethnocide of the Caledonians at the hand of the Romans. The Romans were not really interested in which kind of ethnicity you were, except, of course, you can't call it an ethnocide if you consider ethnicity as, in fact, the main political identity, not genetically or biologically, but literally as a political, cultural construct. So everybody who exterminates others would be an ethnocide in a way. Yeah, in those times, it was pretty much the same thing, right? These peoples also kind of ravaged constantly each other's land. They exterminated, enslaved, destroyed continuously. So really, this is all tribal cultures in history without any exception in total terms, historically speaking. So the Romans just, in that sense, showed how they had gotten really tired of a continuous resistance, right? And a continuous offense, by the way, that is more than just, these people's really fighting for their freedom, right? Again, it's just what every people from the Romans to the lesser tribes really did on each other, right? Except there are the larger powers and the smaller ones. And this background is often not gotten properly, because for those who don't know my channel well yet, who haven't listened to the previous videos I made about, I don't know, the Gallic Fiannas or the Germanic Comitatus, or the same Roman early, the Veritalicum, or this kind of things, the traditional universal identity was exclusively based on a military and religious base, right? That was nothing else in the mental horizons of these cultures. It did not exist, right? And telling the truth, it would be the same today if we hadn't grown morally weak not to realize why the concept of struggle and victory is so important from a political and civilizational point of view, and how and why these peoples attach to victory, right? That kind of absolute confirmation, legitimization of their own accomplishment. Because objectively, if you lose, it's because you have not been able to convince whoever you put in motion to fight the war, or those you had to defeat. And so you just do prove that you are weak, right? So this is a very important aspect that also naturally is to be considered in relative terms. I made several videos about military theory, one of which speaks about the relative meaning of victory and defeat, right? What did it mean for the Picts to be objectively this symbol of unconquered Celtic identity, right? Assuming that they cared about the Celtic one, or they considered themselves as such. As you know, most of Celto-Germanic identity is just Greco-Roman ethnographic invention. They had much stronger local feelings, identities, and prides. But for them it was of radical and magnitudinal importance. I mean, the collapse of Rome and Britain, right? That for the Romans was just, okay, which province do we have to leave in order to have enough troops to fight in the most important continental heartland? Okay, let's bail out of Britain entirely, and let's, think well to write them, saying that the empire cannot defend them anymore. Of course, it was not an easy moment for the empire itself, but let's say it was not about Britain or because of the Picts that this thing had been decided. And in the recent video I made about the Scots, the Scot Irish, I described the very effective coordinate attacks that were waged at the end in the second half of the 4th century that basically had shattered the same Romano-Britonic confidence in the Imperium, as this was a major coalition of powers, again coming even from Gaul, mercenary war bands, pirates, these other Celtic tribes, etc., that were essentially living out of that, right? And individually, they could not afford to launch like a war of conquest per se, right? Just entire peoples with the most hardcore kind of metus hostilis compacted populations of Central Europe with hundreds of thousands, not of warriors, but of people together, so they could support the warriors as well, could take over areas of, eventually millions, mostly Romanized populations that also kind of absorbed them in a few generations from a cultural point of view in turn. But they were, however, functionalized, and this is the important thing for Pictish entity, in that kind of warfare, in that kind of raiding in cursory offensive capacity. And the thing went on. Even today, we don't really talk much about that, but in Saxon times, I mean, there are beautiful even stories sung by bards that were the only ones to leave the battlefield alive, apparently, fanatically suicidal attacks to, Saxon forts in Northumbria from Pictland, from other places. And again, always remembering that these local lords always fought continuously against one another, against the Scots, etc. And so the impression that I formed, let's say, about the general context is still, however, an extremely dynamic one that was pretty much aware of what was going on all around, that we tend also to overlook because these are essentially poorly documented realities, but that doesn't mean that there wasn't a world or connections, or even in the broader, think about the oceans. We know at some point the Romans chased Gaelic pirates up to Iceland. We know who were the Attacoti, for example. Some say they were Germanic pirates, others say they were still kind of some Gaelic pirates. But at the end of the day, we're talking about large spaces. I mean, Frankish piracy reached the Black Sea, right? So we're talking a bit about very far-ranged kind of political and military capacities, projection properly, even by relatively modest powers, right? Even by single war bands or again, that didn't even have properly a real cohesion when they really attacked en masse. Also because their main point was the loot, and not quite, again, having much greater prospect of settlement, especially in areas that were still controlled by the Romans at a point that, yes, could suffer from these raids and, growing weaker, surely, in the areas, having even less resources to defend them, but that wouldn't eventually lead to a Celtic takeover. It would be the Germans who did that, and that also kind of began to impose their imperial mindset on the Celts, that instead were more politically fragmented, and surely they had their own radical imperialistic cult that is beautifully expressed even by Athenaeus, by poets that tell us that, of course, that the universal religion was completely identical all over Europe and the Mediterranean for every single people, and it was exclusively founded on systematic imperialistic subjugation. And there is not really even much deal of a problem about that, because those who would win would be effectively the best at doing that. And so that was the standard rule that everybody believed. And so every time you could rise and offend, that was still seen as, that's divine power. Use it, right? And it's a very beautiful concept, like politically and strategically, because there are many ways to become an empire, which is to use that power to cooperate and not to exterminate just. But most of the times, the latter would be the only possible. Also, because when you are really wall against wall, there are not other options. But it's still up to you. And they realized fully that what individual responsibility in victory and defeat it really meant, right? And this is not just because life was dramatically cheaper and human beings costed dramatically less than today. It was properly about their sense of, let's say, of their real, concrete, direct sense of what the difference between freedom and slavery really was, for individuals as for peoples alike. So essentially, all we know about Pictish warfare in this first phase, right? They appear again after the 3rd century AD, so likely after the Caledonians had been basically destroyed by the Romans, and so some, following with the 3rd century crisis, some other kind of polity out of this trauma from a mental and cultural point of view reemerged, probably in a much more militarized sense, in a much more Romanized sense. As we will see, there are significant traces probably of also of Romanization of the local Celtic warfare. We have seen it also in the video about the Scots. We do know in practice that certain Celtic war bands were trained and equipped by the Roman army and sent back at a point, even in the same Ireland, to make a difference there, politically speaking, and much more, because the Germans also are the Iranians, right? The Arthurian legions about the Sarmatian mounts topped with sword fixed in them, and this kind of presence, which is witnessed among the imperial auxilia, is like, they're not great distances. They all knew each other. right? So the whole thing impacted Pictland as well, right? Even if you look at later, I don't know, Anglo-Saxon warfare and arms and armor, well, the Picts look pretty much the same. You can't draw really a difference in material culture, especially in early medieval times, where there was a radical material poverty, but a very bad one, and especially in this northwestern area in Europe. And you realize that as always, the elites still borrow from everywhere, whereas the rest of the people have just a bit to adapt to conditions of, in fact, traumatic brutality that is witnessed, especially in the Celtic fringe, up to, as you know, the 17th, the 18th century, right? Like becoming a man legally only after you had slaughtered another human being. This was normal up to modern age in Scotland. In fact, a great deal also kind of our understanding of Celtic warfare, especially in the British world, comes from practices that were very well known and documented up to the modern age in those areas, including pagan-derived rituals at that point. People drinking each other's blood was essentially a sworn brotherhood, right, to death before battles, before this. In this clanic view that essentially it was common to all of Europe and originally and derived from the idea that this various imbalances that occurred in a very kind of Malthusian way in tribes that were, very delicate systems relying also on very delicate environment. Everyone say, well, no, there was too many young men. The next spring, this would lead as war bands, right, that were designed exclusively to exterminate men, rape women, and essentially substituting themselves in the local place to found with full legitimacy that kind of war. It's like the rape of the Sabines, right? The Sabine women at the end of the day want to stay with the Romans because they had won, they had demonstrated to be the stronger men, right? This is the same concept. And so you realize that especially in areas where politics were so kind of simple and primitive and underdeveloped, the greater that kind of war bond and kind of ethos really stuck as a sense of political cohesion, right? You had to functionalize this young, powerful, fruitful men in that kind of business so they could maintain a broader political cohesion. And it was an enormous, in fact, clanic force, loyalty, pride that, again, does leave also in, in its witness historically in the later, kind of Celtic independent realities that still believed it was. It's a word that doesn't change. Like there is an incredible level of traditionalism and of also insulation, obviously, right? Not all of Scotland becomes that. The lowlands are more open. That's also where the Romans had settled, where the Anglo-Saxons had settled, where the Normans had settled. It's not a reality. You pick the islands, that's a completely different thing. And their time literally stopped to kind of practices, and that doesn't mean that these people were not capable, right? You find Scots, Irish, as you know, everywhere as mercenaries throughout the Middle Ages, the modern age. They knew what the world was about, especially as clan leaders, as, in fact, leaders of men. The mercenary companies of the later times is nothing but the comitatus a bit more polished in customs, but at the core, it's the same identical thing. And yes, they were savage. I mean, capturing an enemy chipped and alive brought to its ritual decapitation or drowning. There were ferocious military practices, taking heads as trophies. And yes, by the way, it was a real thing. It's not a Roman myth. At this point, everything, the Romans said, have been propaganda, and the rest does. I don't know what people who say this actually think history is, but maybe getting a primary education worth of this name before going in the world would make you think that everybody is provided with something called human dignity. But unfortunately, at this point, it doesn't matter, right? If you only knew anything about history of religions, you would know why, of course, all people beheaded and attached to heads very high power. They wouldn't do that with a slave. They would do that with a chieftain to honor, to literally drink that individual's force. Everybody did it. The Romans were fond of decapitations. The Celts too. The Germans too. They drank from enemy skulls, just like the Sarmatians, the Huns. It was really a normal thing. Fix this, in fact, in your skulls. This was normal every freaking where. It was the total normality of any culture. There is nobody that is special, that is more traditional, that is more European. It's the same freaking thing, because the universal function of how humans work politically in military is the same identical one. And it was extremely fun. Like, you offend Celtic identity if you don't realize that Celts, yes, decapitated their enemies and used their head as trophies, right? Today, instead, it's it's deemed by a lie by ethno-nationalist white supremacists that have to say that, I don't know, the Romans were somewhat the Nazis of the ancient world, to hide the fact that they were, that they are Nazis themselves today, and to pretend that their team was special. You're an idiot, right? Because your team was special exactly because of what was actually true that you're lying about, because you're too radically undereducated to afford a dignified intelligence. That's always the same problem, right? So we have to stop making people pretend that their opinion have any worth. In fact, they don't, right? But this is incredibly important to me because I personally love these peoples, right? I don't have any specific preference. I just tell history, but history must be told correctly, right? And you cannot but avoid loving the peoples you learn about when you know something about them, right? So it's a great disservice to betray what we know from any form of historical, religious, anthropological, and more psychological knowledge about this, which is, it becomes a certainty, doesn't become an hypothesis, right? Underperforming academics who do not know what's the answer to things escape that by saying it's just an hypothesis, right? We don't really know. Well, there are things we don't really know because when we don't have the evidence, we can't say that straight. But let's say if you know enough about the background and you know how to reconstruct a picture that is fully homogeneous, right? Sometimes you don't need that, right? Reasoning by analogy is risky, but there is hardly any capacity in carrying out something that is devoid of risk in the first place. And this man knew that well, by the way, because again, their entire lifestyle was based on risk. And also the women, for that matter. There is a big deal of interesting, we've seen it in video about the Scots, in fact, a female kind of chthonic, telluric, Dionysian dimension, especially in this part of the Celtic world, and that speaks of pre-Indo-European substratum. It was very strong culturally because these were the areas where Indo-Europeans expanded, like the least powerful ones kind of expanded, and kind of came to greater compromise with the local cultures that were very much kind of, in fact, matriarchally based. There is a bit of that in the same Pictish dynastic game. We talked about it in the video about medieval Scotland. And that's also a relatively controversial topic. Not much because there is actual evidence of this. It's just the same concept, say sexually archetypal concept today of masculinity and femininity that a certain part of the political aisle wants to blend without any distinction, pretending that sexes do not exist or they're not important, or that only gender exists and gender is an invention, it doesn't exist. extent, but that were prominent and very powerfully distinctive dynamics of, in this case, especially like from masculine, feminine side, respectively, the Indo-European and the kind of pre-Indo-European Bronze Age civilizations of Europe. But I will make several videos, hopefully, about this topic as well. And let's just go on. So, as we were saying before, about especially this period, the 3rd to 6th century, we are documented about the Picts mainly because of the raids that they carried out, as we've seen extensively, into Roman Britain. Right, so we are lucky in the first place in the history of Europe to have had peoples that were still in this kind of de facto prehistoric reality, because they didn't have a written culture. The same is true for the Germans, etc. With other peoples that instead had massively documented, literary and historiographical cultures that could write about them. Right, we don't know again even too much, also because the late empire is a phase of contraction. The same, say, there is an ethnographic revival after the first wave, let's say, the late Republic, early Empire, that had always, however, been there, especially in Roman culture. But we don't have the same level of insightful kind of analysis that existed in the previous centuries. In any case, we know, in fact, as we were saying before, that the Picts cooperated in large-scale invasions with such other nations as the Saxons, for which the Romans, as you know, had established literally essentially a maritime frontier, where the Saxons were Saxon, and also this other kind of Celtic or other Germanic people's piracy was stopped, but at the same time brought to still the settlement of certain nuclei of these war bands as auxilia and as federati. We've seen it incidentally just recently in the video about the Kingdom of Kent, that kind of embodies best among the various Anglo-Saxon polities that specific origin. So we said also the Scots from Ireland, and the enigmatic Attakot did something where Scandinavians, other things that were fundamentally former Roman Irish tributaries in Ibernia, that however had rebelled as well as this point. As we will see, this is more or less the problem that the Romans always had, also along the Pictish frontier, where there were Picts that were also Romanized and however turned their backs to Rome, because it was more simple, more convenient, but it was a completely normal reality as well. The fact that the Picts operated mainly by sea could speak of the efficiency of Roman land defenses, such as Hadrian's Wall. Some say maybe a natural preference because of some progressed maritime culture of these peoples. As we've seen, there are Brochs documented also in various Scottish islands. And I think it's a good hypothesis as long as, of course, the Roman defenses were effective. It was always, however, a mix of both, right? That it was, say, naval strategy allowed with some greater kind of dispersion. Probably the Romans had means actually to chase, some fleets, and even successful, just as they, especially as they were loaded in loot, just like they were usually successful at defeating on land those raiders that had looted the province and then fundamentally burdened by their treasure, could more easily attack on the way back to the Roman fortresses, and that by the same garrisons. But we're talking about also speedy, kind of lightning attacks that the Romans also could not quite meet effectively in a constant fashion, right? So there was surely a great deal of decentralization of military defense in late Roman times, as you know, with the Limitana, etc. The problem is that the system was collapsing in a political and social sense. So, as always. So it's not that the Roman defenses were ever qualitatively ineffective from a military point of view. It's that whether was there a state or not that made the difference. A presence, a will, right, a moral force to respond. And objectively, some Pictish strongholds were very well designed, located also along the coast to offer shelter to these raiders, etc. It's just that, as we were saying before, they were all essentially autonomously operating chieftains that wouldn't have many other reasons, especially on land, to cooperate in the same way, right? So it was naturally a very fragmented and unstable reality itself that produced further issues for the empire to control, because that's the same reason why the Romans hadn't occupied this territory. So, if you don't have like a permanent stable power already established, it's very difficult to control all peoples, right? The Romans would prefer to actually unite some tribes under a more powerful king, naturally at the expense of the others, to deal with, in fact, in theory, a more powerful, say, potential enemy, but at the same time having greater stability, also because the same polity would understand the advantages of the same. Here, it wasn't really possible. So the Pictish naval capacities are exemplified by the same correct tradition of the Scots. There are some Pictish stone slabs that, in fact, depict more or less the same boats, and these were also, if you think about the times and places, very daring yet very effective means of transportation for, in fact, this very quick raids on the British coast, and again on communities that could not quite always defend themselves successfully, but they would also be able to, of course, at a point. And as we will see now, Pictish land warfare was to probably expand, especially at the collapse of the Roman government, and it would display several interesting traits of cohesion and even modernity for early medieval standards. For example, there were crossbows used of the kind of late Roman type, yes, and they weren't necessarily even more effective than the bow per se, but there is more, right? There is a level of tactical development that suggests the Picts being, for example, much more advanced than the Caledonians in terms of collective training. That is the one that gets down to, and this is in fact one of the other and perhaps the most important political characteristic of Scotland at this point. That is to say, even the presence of cavalry is very indicative of that. That in this far north, paradoxically, the local lordships, as also in a quasi-feudal reality, the same Brochs as castles represent that, the same importance of mounted warfare does it, in fact, and this broader aristocratic ethos that is maintained, of a greater cohesion, properly, of a greater form of organization compared, say, to the much more fragmented Ireland, right? Ireland is also different as a terrain, etc. As you know, the Irish were not meant to have a lot of cavalry in the first place, also because the entire island was covered in forest and was certain areas were really impassable. But let's say for a power like Scotland, that in high medieval times would be mostly famous for its infantry, not much for any specific civilizational sophistication, but simply because they had mostly only infantry, because they had an imperfect feudalism compared to the one of Norman import in Britain. Well, in ancient times, you actually see that they were more kind of centralized compared to the rest of the Celtic world and Celtic Britain in general, which is quite meaningful, and in my opinion makes in fact, the Picts especially sound the most advanced military peoples in the scene. Except, well, we don't know whether it was the Scots eventually that literally took over the Picts or vice versa. There is a debate regarding that, but they were so homogeneous that, and the Dalriata were, after all, in Britain, not in Ireland, in spite of the strict connection, that also you realize that not necessarily being the more advanced, however, necessarily mean to always win. I mean, look at the Romans in that regard. And naturally, these peoples had an advantage being natives, right? So they if anything, knew their territory better. They were there to stay, right? So they had a reason more to push again. And after all, Rome left, as we were saying before, for much kind of bigger scale political and strategic reasons. We know, as you understand, a few about the Picts from historical documents or historiographical sources. Much more is known from archaeology instead, and thanks to the aforementioned Brochs, right? And the Brochs formed in that kind of feudal sense in the early phase of the Pictish expansion, that at a point seems to have absorbed the former Caledonians, right? If we want to assume this kind of simplistic dichotomy between these two peoples really were, but at a certain point there is a takeover, and it is something that cannot, as we were saying before, simply said, well, okay, maybe we're just the same peoples and nothing really changed. Well, no, a lot changed, because the Brochs were not witnessed really before that time. The same Pictish tactics were not witnessed in the same way. So you realize that there is another type of community that has been created. The same people, likely, literally, probably from a biological point of view, the same descendants, etc. But after significant changes, and especially the massive disaster of the early 3rd century, where probably shocked the local political and military culture. You see, there is an idea of primitivism attached to the Celtic fringe. For example, in Ireland, especially at the arrival of the Vikings, historiography talks about the sense that, the Vikings were much more advanced, militarily speaking, than the local Gaels, because Ireland had not suffered any major threat up to that point. On the contrary, it was normally the Celtic pirates that harassed the neighboring countries. But there is a substitution there of maritime brigandage, right, from the Celts to the Norse, with important mixes, of course. But I've always been skeptical in a sense. This concept of, like, it's not just a matter of, peoples are not put under pressure, or just they don't develop a military. Yet it is true, but we often forget how, also the lack of material resources actually means, right? And how long it takes before developing something, first of all, more politically compact, right? If Ireland had been like a single policy that controlled everything and said, well, their military sucked, right? You would say, well, yeah, why didn't they develop one as a regional power fundamentally? Well, it's also because in some lands it takes just more, right? It takes just more to centralize. That's the same reason why Scandinavia took so long to centralize. That's why the same Pict land, in a way, might be more advanced than Ireland did. But it's true that after a shock like the one in the 3rd century, there would be an equally strong reaction, especially in a moment where the Romans had entered a difficult phase. So even in a generational sense, let's say the children that had witnessed the massacres of the early 3rd century would be injected with a radical hatred towards the Romans for what they had witnessed in the following decades to be the next leaders, the next chieftains. Right? It's true that people lived dramatically few, and especially if you're a Pictish warrior. But their children also would remain, and Rome was kind of giving way, right? So there is an important revival there. It takes time, right? As we were saying before, there is not like a massive onslaught of Pictish invasion or conquest. This fundamentally doesn't exist even there, because there was not enough potential. Eventually they had to stop against the same Anglo-Saxons that instead had kind of hegemonized the island. But again, this dimensional dynamics are very important, and they don't have to be overlooked. So in this early power consolidation, even the idea of building this massive fortresses, like they weren't anything like particularly sophisticated or even particularly large. Like if you look at the Roman forts along the frontiers, dramatically more developed, like they're much better preserved, because they were larger, were better built, and whatever. Also the Anglo-Saxons in part occupied this castra, and that's where in fact the Picts keep fighting against. I mean, the Picts even assaulted the same Antonine wall, the same Hadrian's wall, so they knew how to do that. As always, fortresses alone are completely worthless if you need somebody to garrison them, right? So the point of the Romans of having those walls was to stem the main bulk of raids, and then with something more compact. Pictish armies were not particularly large. They were mostly, on average, several hundred men, at most in a few thousand, right? So, but they could concentrate in a part of these defense, and they would immediately pass them hadn't there been some kind of temporary resistance for having also the Roman legions firing the hinterland that also was meant to deter the rest. Also, where the majority of the population in Britain really lived to intervene, right? And if you study the track, the various roads that connected the various Roman castles, you realize there is a geometrical practicality and precision in that helped the Romans maintain, of course, control for after all so long in a land that was not so particularly Romanized in the first place, just mostly the southeast. But the Brochs speak likely of that trauma, right? The idea that, in case of a major raid, these are bulky fortifications, right? It's true, however, that they are not distributed all along, the southern frontier with Rome, right? So it's something else. It's not there was not a broader kind of strategic management of the entire distribution. As we were saying before, the Picts were capable of gathering modest armies, because not for anything, but because it would be very difficult for them to be politically united, because they wouldn't even see like somebody from Orkney, but what would they care after all? Say in terms of immediate threat, and so to dictate most of the political and strategic choices in such massive structural investment like a Broch, what was happening further south. Maybe they were even happy that their rival clans were being threatened by the Romans. And through the Brochs, we see the distribution, we see that Pictish culture spread from the north southwards. Right, so this may speak effectively of the fact that it was the north that had been more spared by the Roman devastations to eventually take over on this more exhausted land in the south, and beginning to lord from such stone towers in a kind of quasi-feudal way over the rest of the population. And Orkney may have been actually the very origin of such fortification type, right? Because there is an especially large number of sites there. And for a while, telling you the truth, I'm not aware about the most updated archaeological literature about the Brochs, but for a long time, these Orkney sites were kind of overlooked in importance, right? Consider too that there is no conspicuous concentration of sites on the nearest part of the mainland either, which could mean, of course, that the Orkney lords were trying to demilitarize that area, not to be, let's say, dependent on kind of a local lord there could prevent their passage, their interference in the mainland. But this would suggest the increased power, and in fact, a very strong power of these centers by Pictish standards. It's a very interesting note. Now, as well as demonstrating that the expanding Picts felt a need for the protection of very strong fortifications, requiring the diversion of a great deal of productive labor, archaeological examination of Broch sites shows that the inhabitants were still generally primitive, right? They lacked, for example, metals. The general structures were very militarily biased, right? They were not even particularly sanitary places to live, let's say, in, right? So they were evidently military structures, emergential ones, even properly strategically thought in that sense. There was naturally an older continuity with the previous, more kind of standard Celtic oppidum kind, right? The Brochs are mostly these are sites that are very, very famous today because other casts, aside from the sites that are beautiful in landscape, but I put some picture here, but because other castles were built on them, famously enough, and the fortification, however, was much more complex. It was a system, as I was saying before. You don't have just one castle. You have ditches, palisades, different layers of walls. It was typical of the Celtic oppida, right? If you read Caesar about the so-called Murus Gallicus in the Commentari del Bello Gallico, you find there really this kind of, almost, in fact, proto-urbanization of the broader Celtic, especially the westernmost Celtic realities in Gaul, partly the Belgian, British, but also these other cultures, in fact, more less, they were essentially Celtic themselves, or Celticized anyway. And so it was a complex. The people lived within there. The Broch per se was the main, in part even they could be a residence in actual fact of a court or something like. But life was also much broader than that in the surrounding community. And naturally, like the early Celtic oppida, these centers were born with the purpose not just of defending, but also of storing resources for offensives, right? So defending, protecting them, but say still being, as we've seen, quite more kind of imperialistically oriented towards the other communities. And the elites, as always, were more powerful, and it's likely that these elites had, in spite of this revival that had some kind of anti-Roman characters by a certain degree, still produced richer elites that were in greater contact with the Roman Empire per se, right? Roman objects were acquired by them by trade or loot, of course, but it was the same thing conceptually, right? And the thing went on later, as we were saying before. they purchased Anglo-Saxon panoplies and so on. So the elite, as always, looks more far than the people. Also because they are elite as they manage the people, so they know better. As the Pictish control spread, however, the Broch fell out of fashion. So demonstrating probably, yes, that there was an important also defensivistic paranoia behind them, right? And Rome declined, the threats from the external probably decreased, at least in that importantly concentrated way. So there could be other reasons, frankly, connected to local demographic dynamics, economic dynamics that we're not aware of, right? But since the timeline is blurry, we could think that the same migration era with piracy, this kind of burning stability, and had rendered necessary the permanence of such fortified centers that, say, until the Viking era, some of these earlier centers had kind of fallen out of use. We know that other buildings were erected with the stones from the Brochs, etc. So were dismantled even in part. There were many, naturally, but also the era of Pictish power base switched around the land, right? So the protagonists of this political strife were based on Brochs, but they didn't control, but in fact their own most of the time, right? So again, there was not a comprehensive, it was a broader dynamic that brought to their construction in this more agitated, stormy times, but this rendered them not necessarily in a cost-benefit ratio. So naturally some stayed in use. One is even apparently represented on Aberlemno's stone, the top part, with an entrance, etc., if it is one, and depicting a combat scene, by the way, that is quite interesting. We'll talk about it later. And other Brochs were abandoned in favor of wheelhouses. This may reflect a greater sense of security, as unfriendly neighbors were tamed, or at least they were not so threatening as before. And existing ring-shaped forts in the newly conquered areas remained in use, right, as habitations as well, so with a more civil purpose. And as well as habitation sites, the Picts left this large number of carved stone slabs, displaying exceptional artistry from which we get very remarkable information about their warfare, because some, at least of the later Pictish stones, show armed warriors. One thing that I didn't point out since the beginning is that the pictures that I'm using here are in fact mostly later than the period we're covering today, right? And in fact, they speak mostly of a more advanced, against more aristocratic culture that is also quite evident in the preeminence of the horsemen, and properly their command, their hierarchical role. They're always above and over the infantry, right? So there is little doubt from everything we see. There are hunting scenes, etc. This was a typically, we could call it feudal culture if it weren't for the fact that, as we were saying before, eventually Scotland was much less of a feudal country than compared to Norman England, etc. And that feudalism took a while before taking off because lack of resources. But still, of course, these were heavily aristocratic and private communities, right? The time of tribesmen, that is more like they were fixated a bit the heroic warfare, right? But still, this was alive in tribal cultures where that had still kind of more having this distribution of power. Even though we see the Brochs declining, this doesn't mean that the aristocracy stopped going up, right? Early medieval times in general, as also a moment of crisis, etc., are a moment of contraction. People abandon their moral force, they entrust power to others. And cavalry also, comparatively with other areas of Europe, increases, as you know, in relevance. So what we see in Pict land is pretty much the same dynamic. And again, I made that video specifically about the Pictish cavalrymen, so I will not repeat myself about that, but it's important to realize this kind of strong question presence again in a land, broadly speaking, let's say the British Isles, where that equestrian culture, as you know, had never been particularly developed, right? The Anglo-Saxons, as you know, that are usually thought to have had a very scarce, if not non-existent, cavalry force. Instead, in my opinion, had even a quite strong cavalry force, especially in quality, maybe not in numbers. And there are even some Pictish stones that would allegedly represent clashes between the Picts and the Anglo-Saxons. Seemingly, they have very little to do with that. But let's say, as the Picts had cavalry, so the Anglo-Saxons had perhaps even a better one than them. Consider the Anglo-Saxons take over a Romanized area with the best land, the best infrastructure. We were again talking about the Kingdom of Kent the other day. They are close to the Merovingian world, so to a deeply Christian Roman legacy in a sense, and their equipment suggests that. I mean, the Romano-Britons were essentially the same Roman army that had relied. Again, there were not radical differences, but this is exactly the point I make, right? They knew what cavalry was. Think about Angus and Horsa. Think about doesn't matter whether objectively, yes, people from the Jutland Peninsula, from Frisia, from even the same Franks. In fact, some of the Anglo-Saxons that migrated in Britain were factually living from the Merovingian Empire, right? Lands as clients, right, of the same Merovingian dynasty. Had less cavalry than other Germans, right? The Goths had lots of cavalry because they had gone east and they had Romanized more. We know that even there was a few surplus, like in Scandinavia, in St. Jutland, and that even infantry was kind of lighter on average, right? But this doesn't mean that, especially through this Merovingian connection, also the Romanized British background, these people were to have, for some reason, no cavalry. Or yes, there's no doubt the Anglo-Saxons had most of an infantry army, but there are many hints and direct evidence of the use of cavalry by Anglo-Saxons, and say mostly in the late period, with talk about an Anglo-Danish and even partly Norman warfare already. Think about Harold Godwinson, who fought on horseback as a Norman in Normandy, as an infantryman in the Anglo-Saxon army, but also, for example, against the Welsh with kind of lighter cavalry, and so they were perfectly flexible, right? The problem is, how much, what's your community about? Like, how is wealth distributed? Like, people are, like, we know most Anglo-Saxon armies still work through the Romano-Germanic levy kind of warfare. The third was still a thing. The Vikings came to destabilize the system. They had an important amount of cavalry themselves, even though they were still more infantry-based because of the aforementioned lack of surplus. Nothing to compare with the Franks and the Normans that were factually Franks. So at that time. But also for early Anglo-Saxon warfare, we have very few evidence in absolute terms. So it's also not normal, aside from later high medieval sources that speak of this alleged lack of cavalry along the Anglo-Saxon military tradition. Not to have that evidence, but if you have the Picts that have horses everywhere, and you know that, I don't know, in Northumbria they were fighting against the Anglo-Saxons all the time, you do know that there was cavalry there. It's not even a question. I suspect it was also a kind of technically wise, like in terms of panoply, equipment, military technology, also superior one than the Pictish. Because still the Anglo-Saxons had, again, more resources and they were closer to civilization. So the military advancement I spoke of before has to do mostly with the political compactness of the Pictish armies that show a great deal of arma, let's say, in fact, synergy. The armed warriors on the Pictish stones are mostly infantry. There's nothing to be surprised of, because that would be the normality in general. These were not mounted peoples, nomadic peoples, etc. Most of them were, again, infantry, and horses costed too much, right, for the horizons of the average person. It's not even that they didn't know how to use one, right, and there was a big deal of cattle raiding and horsemanship connected, but let's say having, affording a collective training on horseback for a lifetime here does not exist. Like, not even the elite has that capacity of having large bodies of cavalrymen, also of heavy cavalrymen, right? Mostly we see horsemen mostly in the guise of javeliners, which means, of course, they charged as well with the same javelins / spears, and there was also heavy cavalry. I mean, of course, in the retinues of the various Pictish kings, you have heavily armored warriors, like in the same Roman or later Anglo-Saxon panoply, because that's what existed there. And again, they were also mostly out of local metals, so even stuff bought or looted from abroad was kind of a more viable way of acquiring that gear. But the majority of people were infantry, and they are often depicted as, with a small square shield and a spear. The square shield is very interesting because it seems, first of all, a flat one, right, which would be, in the Celtic world there is this kind of slightly curved type of shield, also a bit like the Italic scutum type. They're practically the same thing, and again, they existed everywhere. Actually, there's not a usual idea of the Romans stealing or copying technologies. They already had it. It was an Italic thing, telling the truth, in the specific type the Romans developed and used. But the idea of having still, yes, a light type of shield, because it's small, right? So it's but still square, so that covers more, especially the corners, would suggest some kind of shield wall kind of superimposability of this flat small shields, even in fact in infantry versus infantry fight, right? Spears were in that sense also quite meaningful in terms of anti-cavalry capacity, and we know how tough Scottish infantry really was by, the late 13th, especially the early 14th century. It was contingential, like you don't have that moral force. Again, there's nothing technical about military superiority. In any case, it's always about moral superiority. But technology functionalizes to facilitate the job. And so the idea is that there is this lighter spearmen still are capable of forming a quite close-knit, probably clanic-based infantry formation with an importantly solid front line. In fact, we see, interestingly, even in an aristocratic society, such Pictish slabs depicting infantrymen fighting also against cavalry. Right, so the idea that after all in this clan, yes, that there was a big guy mostly fighting on horseback, but still heavily relying on the bulk of the men as infantry was quite strongly alive there, and suggests, in fact, that such cohesion was also providing the opportunity with an important degree of tactical coordination. In fact, we see even archers, right? The majority is infantry. There are a bit of horsemen, bit of archers. That's also quite relevant. The same problem of archery for the Anglo-Saxons has been pointed out. How developed was it? Right? Probably the Normans were more developed, but again, yes, we're talking about a bit more of an isolated British reality, of course. Maybe a little less resources in general also. Because of the level of development, the climate, especially in the Celtic fringe, right? So, but still having a bulk of infantrymen that cooperate with cavalry and infantry, with an important direction from the above, and with a solid, in fact, infantry capacity showed even under the guidance of kings, is really something. Right? This is a post-heroic phase, by the way, because you don't find really chariots anymore. I mean, in the early times, they were saying, even Roman sources speak of chariots, also because, I mean, presumably the same Picts would have done for themselves, and they surely used some of it still, because their entire mythology was based on chariotry, right? The same goes for the Romans. The Romans were obsessed with chariots, but they didn't use it in warfare anymore, because the entire Indo-European mythology was exclusively soaked in that idea of the hero that arrives on the battlefield guided by his alter ego, the angel, the deified version of himself, and just is transported by the forces of the world onto the field where he has to perform the cosmic struggle against evil, right? And so the Picts were still dramatically fanatic about these things, and they lived proving it, by the way, again with an unspeakable degree of violence that cannot be properly described in the complete contempt of any form of human life as far as combat properly, the destruction of the enemy was concerned, because again, it's this same roughness and brutality and violence that we find witnessed throughout all the Middle Age, the modern age, that made that political identity. We wouldn't talk about the Picts otherwise, right? And the stones offer a few clues as to possible tactics, right? As we were saying before, there are some spearmen standing together to beat off horsemen by thrusting with longish spears held in both hands under arms. So this reminds definitely a pike conceptually, right? That is wielded with both hands, because it requires a very specific control on the same, because the length can cause dangerous swings. The use of pikemen suggests large bodies of infantry trained in their use. We don't know too much about their capabilities. They probably, yes, were mostly a defensive arm against cavalry, but they would pass to counterattack, especially considering they were a mass, but still a cohesive mass, right? Because we don't see this kind of cohesion, like let's say in previous times, especially among the Caledonians, as we've seen, had mostly javeliners, scattered behind the chariots and uphill, resisting to much more ferociously drilled and compact Batavian auxiliaries of the Roman army. Here we have something more robust, right? Something that suggests something, namely the upheavals of the migration in your head boosted dramatically the collective cohesion and capacity to maintain it under stress in the battlefield. And again, as a collective formation, because when you have, again, spears held in both hands, most of the time you see there, just like in the much better documented times, somebody that is very determined to stop a cavalry charge even, right? And as you know, late antiquity, early medieval times, yes, witness an increase of cavalry importance, but cavalry is not unchallenged. It's not just per se decisive. It's the most important arm, likely, but it's still heavily challenged by infantry, and especially in areas like the Celtic fringe, right? They mostly relied on infantry, in fact, also comparatively from Ireland, from Wales. One slab shows a kneeling archer with his cloak drawn about him for concealment, so suggesting even some sort of sharpshooter. Other slabs show horsemen with javelins, apparently riding around in a circle, which would be some sort of Cantabrian circle, perhaps. And it wouldn't be so strange after all, but it may also represent some kind of game or form of training that entailed, however, the capacity of assuming such formation. And comparatively with kind of Brittonic warfare in earlier times, let's say at the time of the Roman conquest, there is a greater use of cavalry, right? Again, they were mostly light, right? They were javeliners, and even their equipment, as we've seen, was probably not that heavy, so that archery, think about that, was also perhaps very effective against them. And considering the wild, environment in which most of warfare occurred, skirmishes, raids, such thing, like, it was important to have that missile capacity. And we know how agile and speedy the later Highlanders really were in crossing hills, and just living in appalling moral and physical conditions in this wilderness, that is difficult, even, like, if not impossible, properly for us today. Our bodies is designed to adapt exactly in the same way. It's our mind that has gotten completely unused to that kind of physical effort. And we're talking, again, even I made a video about the late medieval Highlanders, and there are some chronicles describing things like essentially clashes of, again, clansmen that came there. Double-handed swords at this time did not exist, literally chopping each other to pieces until the last one was standing. Like, that's the kind of I don't even can find an adjective to stress the like, what should be a traumatic concept just to imagine for us, right? Just to picture, right? But for them it was normal, right? They spent their entire existence exclusively in function of that, right? So they were perfectly adapted to the they were quite effective. Again, it was an extremely primitive system, because of course the more you invest on the individual, and the least it means you can do collectively, which is not a very good indicator in terms of strategic capacity. But it's what they had, right? And in that environment it kept existing because it was the only one that worked, really. So we know naturally also from the Scottish sources how intense the training of especially the nobility really was. The practice of fostering, just like in later times becoming a squire in somebody else's household and being brought under and to be radically psychophysically abused, to be literally destroyed as a human being and reconstructed as a pure killing machine literally was. It was like fostering another nobleman child was a great honor, because it meant that you were being deemed quite effective in that kind of education. We know that were probably certain tricks, certain moves, right, in their military training, with weapons, with the body, in that were designed to be quick, fast, capable, and just with the sole purpose of killing. There was also a psyching up of the warrior in all this. That is, again, the most important thing that lived in the entire, in fact, purpose of these people, in their legions, in their identity, in their stories. They were all revolved around warfare, without any exception, and it was especially designed for the elite, that was elite in virtue of these capacities and this identity and the possibility literally of subjugating other people. That were, however, functional, like, that were the same ones that obeyed their orders, same ones of the phalanx, as we've seen, the same ones that would cooperate with them, without which they could have not really gone very far. It was also a system where it was relatively easy to rise to the top, right, considering how poorly stratified the society was. So, again, a lot of high-level militarizations, because they were literally constantly at war with one another, trying to prevail on one another. Individually, as we were saying, that these people were probably capable of doing any kind of stunt on horseback. Like, the nobility truly had the opportunity of doing that, right? Fighting as in larger coordinated bodies of heavy cavalry was a bit of another story, but again, mostly because it was difficult to put together enough people, which costed a lot politically, socially, for convincing even somebody to have such a large amount of forces. And surely at a point they were. We can compare part of what we've seen with the previous Caledonian times from Tacitus' account of Agricola's Battle of Mons Graupius. The Caledonians consisted of swarms of infantry throwing javelins from hill slopes, while chariots maneuver on the flat. So, very reliant on terrain, which was probably true for the Picts as well. Some say, the Picts had more cavalry, had to search kind of more open engagement. Well, this has few to do with that. The most important thing is realizing that, yes, they had probably more offensive capacity than before, because cavalry warfare on a larger scale is the proof of a more advanced and, in general, probably a more collectively effective reality than, say, having war chariots around and relying on essentially weaker people, javeliners, not infantrymen that can withstand like a charge, right? Lots of things had happened. You know that the same Roman army historically, towards the 4th century, becomes much more functionalized in stopping enemy cavalry charges, because they had met ever more impactingly charging peoples, such as the Sasanians, the Sarmatians. But the same Germanic infantries were pretty tough, right? So the Picts also had toughened up from those times, right? The Caledonians were objectively a more primitive military culture than them. Also, the Roman cavalry at Mons Graupius, I made a video, by the way, I have to re-upload it because the pictures are still blurred, but it's pretty much in detail. They had no difficulty dealing quickly with those chariots, right? Again, in Europe, the Mediterranean, this chariot warfare did not exist anymore. It was obsolete, right? Infantry was much tougher. The same Celtic world had abandoned at large chariot warfare. Chariot warfare existed only in the more underdeveloped areas, in the far north of Europe, in North Africa, let's say among the Garamantas, etc. But the world had aged, right, and had developed further. So the Battle of Mons Graupius is a display of the sheer brutal efficiency of the Roman military civilization and the capacity of using the other peoples, like such as the Batavian infantry, that did again most of the job, and those weren't even the Roman legionnaires, by the way. It tells you also the differential that existed between the Roman and the Celtic world, right? There's been a kind of Celtic revivalism that, as I was saying before, has not rendered any dignified service to the historical memory of the Celts, because they just pretended to make kind of a parallel civilization to the Roman one. I don't understand what they really were. And yes, the British Celts were the ones with the lowest military quality all over the Celtic world, right? The best ones were the Belgians, and I mean probably the continental one. I mean also the Helvetii, of course, and mostly because of also the proximity with the tougher Germans that were essentially taking the Celtic world over, for not talking about the Romans. So this kind of Celtic revivalism mostly stems from some sort of insular ethno-nationalistic echo chambers. I mean, I don't know from video games, from kind of just looking at only what you want to look at and not even reading sources, just blaming the Romans for being some sort of chronicle liars about anything, so that everything they say you can twist, like the average idiot without education can think whatever he wants over, people like, Tacitus or Caesar, that perhaps you should learn how to respect if you want to be respected as well, in the basics of humanity. But and so this whole idea of the genocide thing, the Celts were doing the same exact things, and plus amongst one another, right? So I don't really know where you want to get with that, honestly. You have to look at military history, what we have sedimented in actual, especially these sources this time, like what we know from 2,000 years to now, right? And it matches with everything we have learned archaeologically and all in the other possibly connected disciplines about what those cultures were, and everything is perfectly coherent. So any diversion from this, first of all, it's unfounded every time you see one, but secondly, it's also pretty much paranoid and ill-fated in the first place. But you have to admit, yes, the British world was less than even just the continental Celts, and Celtic quality was not that high in the first place compared to other military cultures. So sorry to say that. Again, I have Celtic origins myself. I know for a very specific reason, and I love them. But I also know what I know, and so I will not lie to you in the first place. What the Picts show instead, and that it could help, right? There's the same people, so the same descendants of the Caledonians, right? So what you see there is a dramatic improvement, after all. Yes, it did happen through Romanization. It did happen through the higher political cohesion and therefore military effectiveness of the migration era. That is to say that cavalry plus archery that we don't see in Caledonian armies could have easily taken out the chariots that had become obsolete, right? There are also many debates regarding the properly what the coordination could that be at Mons Graupius, especially on that kind of defensivistic position, but very difficult ground also for the chariots to pull back ideally. And the chariots were actually quite mobile, and was an enormous agility of Celtic warriors again, but collectively, you don't make things work like that, right? They're too messy, disorderly, and doesn't work. I mean, the chariot exists in that sense because it's very agile, and so, right? It had suspensions, It was something you had to keep balance of, like with your body. It really took an athlete to do that. But again, it's just for making the single damn thing acting on its own, right? So collectively, things were much more complicated, and that's why cavalry also develops further, because it's something much more truly flexible and punching at the same time, plus archery as well, that has an important anti-horse capacity. 2. The more determined Pictish spearmen also were surely something much more punching and resistant than a mass of disorganized javelin men, who are also spearmen, by the way. Consider this, that there is no such thing like a difference between a javelin and a spear. Like, there is a functionalization of the two towards the extremes, but in between, spears were normally thrown. And this was the standard, essentially, for any warrior in antiquity, except maybe the Macedonian phalange. But literally, that's the exception that confirmed the rules. Okay, there is the nomadic step as well, but that's it, literally. Talking about sedentaries, tribesmen especially, that's the standard reality. The problem is that, if, again, it's always, why did I say moral forces and collective training? Because that's literally it. If you do not have cohesion, it's because you don't believe in what you're doing. Either because, I don't know, there's an elite that has crushed you, and you have let yourself being crushed, and so you're not motivated, whatever. So you can have the same amount of spearmen, and one being very tough, lying, and the other just being a bunch of guys that run around throwing their spears every once in a while. The same people equipped in the same way, right? So the Picts evolved, functionalized, probably also with an important amount of spear of pikes to cope even with importantly mounted enemies, as they would have found, especially in the late Roman army, and even among the Anglo-Saxons, actually, right? Because especially by that scale of, let's say, numerical scale of engagements, like they were, as we've seen, relatively small from the Pictish side. Well, the single combat has kind of a greater importance. So about cavalry, even that massively collective aspect of maneuvering and punching is relative, right? And so even, I don't know, maybe 40 well-armed Anglo-Saxon horsemen are a big deal when they confront, say, 300 Pictish spearmen, right? So you have to consider this kind of things and testing each other on that level. And this surely happened all the time in Northumbrian, Pictland, and etc. And that was also, as you know, quite equestrian frontier, right? Because of also this, in fact, the sparsity of the engagements, raiding warfare, and this kind of mobility needed on that space, on that land. And the Pictish cavalry, in this sense, matches perfectly the raiding needs of that strategic theater, right? So, yes, all what we see from the Picts points at a more compact political body, also administratively having single monarchs, the capacity of erecting the Brochs. So the benefits of a single command may have been decisive in the change from Caledonian times, confirming the Clausewitzian paradigm of moral superiority. And Septimius Severus' 3rd century campaigns in Scotland that drastically weakened the tribes and left them easy victims, with massacres, rapings, deportations, destructions. So that for 1 century, in fact, do not bring to any significant threat posed by the Picts. Before I said, yes, the first generations, but surely hated the Romans for what had happened, and the memory was fresh, those massacres also after 1 century. So you don't need even to hate the Romans for that to be wanting to plunder their territory, because as we've seen, that's what the same Celts did on one another all the time. But again, they were just about that, right? So that plus the instability following to the migrations that they also, the same Picts triggered with their raids, etc., militarizes them further, makes them more compact, teaches them how to be more organized, to attack on a larger scale, something that had never been seen before, right? Since the Romans conquered Britain, like there wasn't like a major phase of piracy or problem up to the 3rd, 4th centuries. So you notice an increase definitely in the 4th, in the second half of the 4th, where the Picts are protagonists together with the Scots, and you realize there was a functionalized increase in political and military effectiveness. Metus hostilis, the Romans would have said. It's obvious, as we were saying before with the example between the two spearmen formations, that the same Caledonian military system was the Pictish one in an evolved form, right? So again, the Celts literally fought in the same way everywhere. Like there was no difference. As we were saying before, some still had chariot warfare more than others, but let's say when people say, this people, let's say, fought technically, tactically in a different way, say, I don't know, those who inhabited in the mountains, they had phalanxes, the ones closer to civilizations too, because they were copying the Romans and the Greeks. That's a pile of garbage, right? Celtic word fought exactly in the same only way everywhere, right? From 30 kilometers from Massalia to Pictland, Celtic warfare was identical, right? The only thing that changed is how more or less politically compact they were, right? And so how also much time they had to gather, to plan, to supply this, to arm the troops, to give them a reason to fight in the first place. But tactically wise, it was identical, right? There was no difference. Any other people fundamentally fought the same. I mean, look at even the same Roman legionary. It's not that conceptually it's something that different from that medium type of infantryman that was present again everywhere, right? It's just the same. There are lots of intersections. So again, this a radical hysteria of needing forcefully to categorize in a diametrically opposite way the Romans with the Celts is just pure mental illness, and it doesn't have any ground on any military historical base. The Gallic declension is identical to the second Latin one. They were the same people, right? This is the point that is often not understood, and that I relentlessly make the effort of kind of emphasizing against any kind of national socialistic delusion stemming from statalism, collectivism of the fourth estate that thinks it can equate ancient identities to the contemporary fictions. This is not how history works, right? It must be extremely clear and brutal about it, because there is no other intelligent way of thinking. As we were saying before, even quite late Roman accounts make several references to North British chariots. So, again, the kind of chariot cult was still there. We still find, I don't know, early imperial Roman, Illyrian nobility that still buried its members with chariots and horses. It was a symbol of prestige and power and strength, and yes, they would keep using chariots as well, considering the heavy mark that heroic warfare has in these cultures, and of course because it was functional as well, right? The dichotomy between even the distinguishing Caledonians and Picts is excessive, right? We're talking about the same people. It's just that, again, as during from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, you see cavalry develops for some reasons that are of increased, essentially, political compaction, of statal development. Chariots start becoming too bulky, too elite, too incapable of coping with everything at once. Right? Cavalry is much more multifunction. And one would also expect to find at least some infantry carrying javelins instead of thrusting spears. Right? Javeliners existed all over still. They often open hostilities. There were surely javeliners running behind cavalry and skirmishing in front of the ranks. Consider that Pictish warfare was deeply imbued with still that kind of violent, sworn brotherhoods, right, of the deities of war, like the Fiannas fundamentally, for which the idea was that the initiate had to start proving his worthiness of belonging to the deity, because he didn't belong to, he was not a human anymore, was just like actually an animal of the deity and of the lowest type. And so that the first stage of being part of this war bands was being a literal animal. We see it prominently in Pictish art everywhere, and just also in Scottish literature, at least oral tradition. The wolf head, the animal's heads, the torque symbols, the idea of the chain, that is the same one of the berserkers in the Danish folklore, it was all like that. Watch that video about Gaelic warrior that I made, and it explains everything. And so the younger element, the more elastic, fast of the army, had to skirmish in front of the ranks, risking their lives, because they were being tested. Right? This is just like the German chieftains that spent their time watching naked boys running among spears, and somebody screwed up. They ended up, transpassed. This is not very different from Romans watching some of those captured rebel chieftains being eaten alive by wild animals in an arena, because that was to toughen up, right? If you wanted to be part of manhood, of virility, of power, of force, of politics, of the army, so you had to see that you could risk your life on the spot, right? Getting killed if you want, because especially if you entered the Fiannas, you literally, this is something we have forgotten as contemporary, but you do not belong to yourself anymore. Your people belong, first of all, to other people, but in general to the deity. Right? It's normal to see slaves. There are slaves all over, but you are somebody else's person. And if you don't work correctly, you have to be taken out of the system. This is also what their entire religious system was about, right? You do not have a freedom of conscience. You have to obey what the group does, because if you go against it, you put in danger the whole freaking system. This is exemplified by Germanic laws, whatever. Of course, there were certain cults that were illicit in that sense, but you had a duty to fulfill. Right, so that's it. Once you had sworn that oath of brotherhood, like drinking each other's blood, it was for life, right? And that's naturally why some could not keep up with that, and why there were so many feuds and bloodshed and instability in the same place, because those were means aimed exactly at strengthening the bond in quite turbulent communities that didn't have that kind of collective discipline. And it was the only way, and it all rested on you, right? So yes, especially the younger elements of the army skirmishing, also because they were poorer, they had not killed and looted enough to have a decent equipment, had to demonstrate to all the others that they were worth human beings, because if they weren't, they were better dead. It was that simple. Crossbows, we have seen them. There are at least a few documented on the Pictish stone slabs, and they're surely a late Roman influence. At least crossbows are not documented, if not in the Hellenic and speaking of the West, and Roman armies. They were more widespread than is commonly believed, and there is nothing particularly innovative in them. I mean, bows were, generally speaking, more effective. This was not like in the Middle Ages when the crossbow was objectively superior to the bows, contrarily to what longbow mythology had wanted to make you believe. But they were still relevant because they show probably that anti-cavalry function needed. This sometimes were also hunting weapons for that matter, but they could be more easily employed. Consider how effective the crossbows were in medieval warfare in fortified situations from castles especially. Well, think about the Pictish Brochs and may associate that with a crossbow as well. It wasn't the majority missile weapon though, right? That's what we get, right? There were bows, long bows, again, depending on the size of who used them. And in the West, bows are made exclusively one only composition, right? The Romans may have deployed at some point some kind of composite bows equipped forces. Think about the Sarmatians, etc., but we don't have essentially evidence of any of that sticking in the West, if not in places like Italy, like especially the Byzantine areas, or southern Spain, like. But this doesn't concern the British Isles. But the Pictish crossbow is still very relevant because it shows how throughout the Middle Ages, probably the crossbow had never disappeared. It had always been around, right? It starts reemerging clearly, mostly in Frankish warfare in the sources in the 10th century, right? There is something, however, before, and you realize then that what is not documented doesn't mean it's not there. As it's often, there is nothing, again, particularly revolutionary or, technologically resolving about having a crossbow. It's just a bow like any other. And that, at this point, is not even dramatically developed, right, in composition for that matter. But the crossbow still increases that idea of advanced combined arms system that the Picts might have had in their tactics, and that's quite relevant. Again, having this heavy, this kind of bulky pikeman hedgehog, right? A bit like the Skiltrum later on. Skiltrum is just the name for me. It was not even properly connected to the type of formation, the circular one, etc. In fact, it refers mostly to the shield, even not to the formation or any other particular capacity. It's just like it's saying the shield wall in a way. Yes, I mean, this important stopping power that can even shoot something with bows and crossbows against some kind of mounted enemies of sort is interesting. And as I was saying before, I believe that there was much more cavalry around in Britain than is normally believed. Even not just in late Roman times, but even in Anglo-Saxon times. So I want to see that making sense. Also because, consider always this, that whoever ruled Britain, at the end of the day, tried to take over Scotland, right? This was kind of normal. It was true, as we were saying before, with the with the other, essentially the Gauls that took over Britain. It's true with the Romans, it's true with the Anglo-Saxons, it's true with the Anglo-Normans, it's true with Vikings. So these were all cultures that at the end of the day came from the continent where cavalry warfare was very developed in a way or another, at least probably more developed in fact than locally. Maybe just for the Vikings we can point out that at that time the Picts and later the Scots were kind of more proficient than them in mounted warfare, but I don't think so personally. I think that Vikings already, and especially for the Vikings, not even necessarily Scandinavia, that had however, still a big deal of equestrian influence, even from the steppes and during the migration era, had better cavalry, right? Exactly because the Viking function was strictly military, so these were mercenaries. They were essentially professionals, right? They literally destroyed what was any form of Scandinavian tradition. They began to do things that unhinged the system and that enriched themselves to become more military performing and to launch other raids to keep that going on. Well, that's exactly what I mean when I say that the Picts had developed further from Caledonian times, exactly because they started doing the same raids during late antiquity. Right? So it's the same identical dynamic, right? And so that's quite important, because otherwise you don't see even there, Scandinavian warfare having had kind of prodromes of particular toughness. If you don't see what the Vikings specifically were doing as Vikings and not as generally only as Scandinavians. So these are also very important things in the history of civilization, still maintaining that Viking warfare, frankly, was not more advanced than the continental one, for example. But by certain degree, not even, let's say, it was at least comparable with the Anglo-Saxon one, right? Even though it was difficult to stem, but the Danes don't really destroy England, right? They just rule at best as kings of it for a while. So that's different from and just in a system that was rather feudalizing in direction rather than, and also receiving in fact a lot of influence from the continent as well. That's very overlooked as well. The main problem the Picts posed the Romans lay in their numbers overall, right? Especially if reinforced by other nations and their ability to move by sea and thus bypass the land defenses. As we've seen, they attacked simultaneously on different fronts. That was the numerical problem. They were small parties generally, but they attacked all at once, and so they were difficult to counter, because where do you send your forces? You can't control everywhere. And these peoples are more driven than to attack you in that way than for you to defend in the first place. Also because Britain is always more on its own, by the way. So one attempt to foil sea raiders was the Roman use of light warships painted blue to be inconspicuous, which could sink a small fleet or dog a report on a larger. And the boats were themselves called Picti, right? So the Korag, this other boats were used in general, were also used by the same Romans, right? They may have given the same name to the people, to the Picts, like pirates or something. But the Pictish numerical superiority could be relied on to cure itself in time, as there would be a constant diminishment caused by successful looters taking their gains home individually. So once you had the loot, well, then it was over. Like, nobody would come back there. So because there was nothing to loot anymore. And it was it. It was about organizing the main thing, but eventually not really occupying these areas. Of course, we see, let's say, from Ireland, especially a more direct coastal occupation at some point. But also when the Romans had already left, also the Anglo-Saxons had invaded from the east. So there was also a shift of the Romano-Britonic element, or rather Celtic areas, towards the western side of the Isle, literally, and or to Armorica / Brittany at that point for that reason. So those are also other complicated things. So it's obvious that during the migration era it would be even a successful Pictish settlement somewhere else, further south, maybe even very far away places. People traveled, moved, whatever. In any case, as we were saying before, the Romans used to, let's say, attack the main body turned for home, loaded with booty, and driving vast herds and flocks of the raiders. So even a relatively small Roman field or naval force could have good prospects of success in the operation. It would happen. However, again, not only it was very difficult to chase the single elements altogether. Again, huge concentrations of these troops in a single place were rare. Not because it would have not made political strategic sense, but because they could not afford that. They didn't have anybody agreeing to concentrate those forces on a single command. They didn't have it. And it would have been more punching. It would have brought also to a much more direct land grabbing that the Romans would have had to counter much more seriously. And of course, the fact that this wouldn't happen was also partly the same success of the Roman deterrent, because these were not, again, populations capable of fielding the same standards of the imperial army, so they avoided that in the first place. But there is not just tactics, nor just strategy, nor just war, right? There is politics and society. These raids still left the Roman province depopulated and impoverished, so less able to pay the taxes, to maintain the defending soldiers. And as we will see now, also eventual settlements of the same peoples as kind of guards, garrisons, even local subjects would at some point alienate even the same loyalty to Rome of these areas. And not because at that point it was much of the settled colonist / soldier not to profit from Rome. They were doing it. Sometimes they were just deported slaves, but I mean, if they had wanted to flee back in, it was difficult to really to control them anyhow. The point was, again, that Rome was given ground elsewhere in general, and so at a certain point they simply abandoned Britain. And other methods that were effective against the Picts' predecessors on the frontier could probably have worked against the Picts themselves if sufficient forces had been available. The first of these was to pay a subsidy to the tribes immediately beyond the frontier to provide a forward defense. These were kings that were more or less involved with Rome. They had already, they were careful about not screwing up because they were the easiest ones to reach for a retaliation. But they were at the same time the one who would seize more quickly the opportunity of a weakened imperial frontier. And considering the general political instability, very often the changes could be very, very wild, right? After all, these people had a very short term, like today, not very different from today, kind of predictability, kind of investment type strategic analysis. You cannot know what the world will be 4 months from now. Nobody knows that, right? There are more likely things than others. And yes, this was not a dramatically dynamic world, right? There were certain hardcore demographic, economical dynamics that were very difficult to change. But still, politics is always more important than all of it. So it's obvious that the frontier was open, as we were saying before, so the Romans could patrol well forward with cavalry to keep an eye on the friendlies, right? The Romans had invaded Scotland. They had properly tested it. Mons Graupius was the destruction of that, Caledonian force opposed to Agricola in that expedition. The Romans had broader interests in the far north, this kind of other Indo-European obsession about the Great North, the place of the eternal light, and so Britain was already an enormous achievement for the fact that in the mythology, not even the gods had ever gone there. So the Romans saw this as a huge pride. And so the Roman presence was there, was felt, was evident, and the empire would back the allies with a mobile striking force if they looked like being overmatched. For which it's obvious that economizing on subsidies, failure to patrol, or leaving the friendlies unsupported, especially in a moment of crisis, could lead to them changing sides in big or in self-defense. This is the same thing that happened, I don't know, in the northwest frontier of British India. And it's quite obvious, right? Why do all these raids from the north? Is it because it was a greater force that popped out somewhere? No, it was that the big one was disgregating, so it was giving way, and this one just began to speed up the process. But it was, generally speaking, caused by the internal crisis. What do you think? The Magyars, the Vikings, the Saracens happened? Why didn't they exist like in what? As incursors and looters as there before. It's because some magic force that appeared from nowhere. The whole freaking Carolingian Empire was collapsing. So it's a defeatistic and victimistic and weak mentality to think history like at a certain point the invader came, as if there were and successful. It was successful, by the way, if the locals were kind of normal, right? What you have is, when somebody resists and they get taken out, the actual stronger force is from the side of those who succeed. And it's a political and social strength. It's not a military one. You cannot convince anyone to do what they want if you don't have a good reason, right? And that's where somebody will resist successful. And you will have made a mistake. So, in terms of the Roman Empire, you should much be more concerned about the fact of how it was created, not how it failed. Also because, in the meanwhile, there is like half a millennium of history and of stability, fundamentally. The ultimate sanction was to collect an overwhelming field army and invade the raiders' homeland. So the method was pretty simple: burning their huts, devastating their crops, killing or enslaving everybody, literally, that could be caught, and to keep on doing it until the enemy gave battle or offered submission. So a very valid maneuver, and generally speaking, you do it when you expect that kind of resistance and you want it to concretize, because you're essentially pressuring them to say, if you don't do it, we will just kill everyone, right? And at that point, if they had something to oppose, they would try that. But if they wouldn't or be defeated, they would be subjugated. And the Romans actually estimated those peoples who initially resisted, and when they crushed them, normally they respected, they gave them an opportunity of submission, and entailed the process of Romanization. It was actually a much better deal than what most of other peoples would have offered in case of conquest. But they had no tolerance towards those who had initially been maybe crushed and submitted, or submitted anyway, and then rebelled after. If they did that, you could literally expect to become what the Romans called a desertum. Means everybody gets exterminated. And that's a pretty effective move, right? If you wonder how also the Romans successfully maintained the order in the empire for so long, well, it's because they weren't kidding. And they took the whole thing pretty damn seriously. So the others, evidently. So the effects of such expedition could last until a new generation of young warriors had grown up, and the last of those that had experienced the disaster had died, exactly because of the tension triggered. But of course, a destructive process, especially in those times, like in pre-industrial times, you would bring to massive collapse, right? This was not even necessarily what an empire would seek for, because the main problem of these people is exactly that they had reached the bottom of the kind of the level of development. So there was not even properly much you could destroy, and the need to fight a war in such a faraway place where there was nothing to gain from also escaped the Roman interest. And this is the only reason why, I don't know, this far north has not been permanently occupied. Not because of any military toughness of the same. It's just that people are going to rise again, and you cannot, demographically, you cannot really control them because they're all fragmented. So you know they're going to make some mess. In the world balance of the empire, this is practically irrelevant. And that's the reason why this is basically a region where the Romans simply bailed out themselves for other reasons, right? It was not really conquered by somebody else. They simply left their own government there, the Romano-Britons, and then goodbye, right? You know, without field army, that there could not be much that could be done. In fact, also the local British society collapsed because much of the elite probably came back to continental Europe, fled to it at least, and so we know that even land owning system was shattered, etc. This is where, exactly as we were looking at in the video about the Kentish kingdom, the legend goes that Vortigern called the Germanic forces to cope with the incursions of the Picts. So even they're proving that the Picts did not really have the political social cohesion to take over Britain, but they were a pain in the behind for a force now that was devoid of the professional army, or at least of the properly what the imperial one had been before leaving as a field one, and asked the Germans to come in. And these ones take over because they are much more probably compact in terms of political, let's say, military aptness, and they gradually infiltrate here and take over, right? So this is the thing, right? So the Romans really probably never properly tried against the Picts. There were too many needs for the army elsewhere, like to be involved, and that's also the reality that the Pictish development occurred as essentially part of the same Roman Empire, and this probably explains also the characteristics of some of their warfare, right? And also the increased military standards over time that other people in fact witness exactly at this time. Again, in that video about the Giles, we explained how powerful this reason could be, right? So it's really documentable and likely, and let's say supported by an important historiographical set of considerations. Anyhow, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.